Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. We warmly welcome you to this critical discussion. My name is Dulce Guzmán, and I am the Executive Director of Alianza Américas. Un breve mensaje en español. Agradecemos también a quienes se han conectado en vivo. Les recordamos que este evento está
We
siendo grabado
also
y contará
thank
con
those who
interpretación
are joining us
simultánea
live
en
and will
inglés
have
y español.
simultaneous
Use el
interpretation to
icono
Spanish and
del
English.
globo en la
Please
barra
use
inferior
the
para
globe
seleccionar su
icon
idioma
in the
favorito.
bottom part of your screen to choose
We are
preferred
very excited
language.
about the opportunity of co-convening this event with the Center for Engagement and Democracy in the Americas, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, Human Rights First, and Refugees International. This joint effort reflects our shared concern and drive to support human rights organizations in El Salvador. Thank you again for joining us from the various locations. This is indeed a global concern. We are joined today by Noah Bullock, Executive Director of Cristosal, and one of the key voices in the defense of democracy and human rights in Central America. We will be discussing the rapid decline of civic space in El Salvador and how human rights organizations are responding to an increasingly authoritarian context. Since March of 2022, El Salvador has been living under a state of emergency that has been extended for nearly 40 months, supposedly to address gang violence and ensure security. Fundamental human rights are suspended under these extraordinary powers, such as freedom of association and due process, resulting in the mass detention of more than 86,000 people, including thousands of children. There is very little information about criminal trials against those detained, and pretrial detention has extended without any information on the detainees. Additionally, various organizations have denounced a pattern of abuse and criminalization of critical voices. Recently, Amnesty International declared 2 human rights lawyers and an evangelical pastor to be prisoners of conscience, noting that arrests are part of a systematic strategy to silence dissent. In recent months, Cristosal has been the target of escalating repression by the Salvadorian government, including the arrest of Ruth Lopez, head of its anti-corruption unit, on questionable charges and without due process guarantees. Following the raid of its offices, accusations of money laundering, and the tightening of legal restrictions on civil society organizations, Cristosal announced the closure of its operations in El Salvador after 25 years of work. Most of its team was relocated outside the country, and the organization denounced these actions as an attempt to silence them and their work defending human rights. Cristosal has been a leader in prompting human rights, supporting victims of violence and forced displacement, and defending the rule of law. And in a context of growing authoritarianism and harassment of social organizations, it remains firmly committed to justice. Noah, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. We really appreciate that you are taking some time out of your valuable time to speak with us. I would also like to invite our audience to submit any questions they may have during the conversation in the question and answer section, and we will try to address as many of them as possible at the end. Noah, how are you?
Good, good. How you doing, Dulce? Good to see you, and thank you so much for putting this on. I think since Ruth's detention and our announcement last week, it's just been so important to all of us, our staff, the overwhelming support and solidarity that we've received from so many places. So thank you so much for being a part of that, and everyone connected today too for walking with us.
Thank you again for the time. I know you all are managing and juggling many things, and it's really important that we continue to spread the word about what's happening in El Salvador, and the incredible work that Cristosal has been doing. So today I have many questions. I would appreciate if you could provide some brief answers so we can get to most of them. So I'll start with one. How and why was Cristosal founded in El Salvador? What was the original mission of the organization?
Well, there's an interesting backstory. I think that the organization or the idea for the organization was founded while the bishop of the Anglican Church, Martin Barahona, was in exile in Panama, and he had these conversations with an American priest, Richard Bauer, about when the war would be over and when he would return, that he wanted to do something. So it is interesting, it's an irony in some ways that here we are 25 years later, some of us in exile wondering what the organization is called to do in this new context. But that's the origin too. Exile, I think, is a cycle, a historical cycle, sadly, in the region. But the idea was that when peace returns to El Salvador, that the churches should have a vehicle to walk with the people in this new moment. One time the bishop said to me that with the peace, people earn the right to be their own voices. And you remember that during the war and previous to the war, Oscar Romero, for example, was the voice of the voiceless. And after over a decade of armed conflict and much loss, the Salvadoran people could have an equal say in a democratic society and be a part of building the peace. And Cristosal was founded with that spirit to walk with people, to build capacity, to participate in a democratic society, to make a voice, to defend rights. And it had, different moments. Early on, it was, I think the early mission was very much focused on building bridges too, between the Salvadoran churches and the communities with North American communities. And also, I think it had early on kind of a broad vision of like anything that was needed. And what happened actually was that the moment we were founded, there were two terrible earthquakes that hit El Salvador. And the bishop told me that in some ways he felt like Cristosal was a super important vehicle to be able to provide support and assistance in rebuilding after the earthquakes, but that set the organization in sort of an what we call like an asistencialismo mode, like an assistance-based mode for the first part of its history. And when I became the executive director, the bishop said to me that he wanted the Cristosal to play in the major leagues, he said, and to be a big league actor and develop programming. And that was sort of a point of inflection for the organization. In 2005, they established the Human Rights Office. There was a communications program, work in the communities, but the bishop wanted the programming to grow. And I think that was when we had the clarity that the organization was called to be a human rights organization and to continue to pursue our original mission with that clarity.
Thank you so much for sharing that. It sounds like much of those values, and as you said, the spirit of the original mission continues, maybe in different ways. New programs, as you said, Cristosal has been essential in creating several human rights reports to ensure that there is documentation of what's been happening over the last few years. So I'm curious, until earlier this year, until January 2025. What was Cristosal focused on? How has its work in the region evolved? You mentioned a little bit from the entering of your directorship, but was there work that you all were doing prior to the beginning of this year, and how has that changed now?
Yeah, I think that the work has evolved through our accompaniment with the Salvadoran people and their emerging needs. And one of the very first things that Cristosal's Human Rights Office was doing was operating the UNHCR's program to assist people seeking asylum in El Salvador. So after the war, UNHCR pulls out, and they left this office that was administered by civil society groups, and Cristosal was one of them with the church. But as gang violence grew in El Salvador, Salvadorans began to seek support and assistance at our office. People fleeing extortion, fleeing the threats and violence of gangs. And that, but around 2009 to 2012 really became clear that that was a huge need. And that we had, although the mandate of the UNHCR office was to provide non-Salvadorans with assistance to seek protection there, we needed to be able to build programming to protect people, Salvadorans fleeing gang violence. And that was the beginning of our work with internally displaced people. We didn't actually even have that term, I think, until later on. I think I went to a trip to Colombia and I met with internally displaced people, and they self-identified with that and said that as internally displaced people, we have rights. And that was like, that's what these people in El Salvador, that's what the Salvadoran people are and have. And so that decision was transformative for the organization because we began to build capacity for direct and sort of comprehensive assistance to people fleeing violence. And that's one of our core program areas is the direct assistance and protection assistance. Then I would say there's like another moment that was also not planned that definitely had a huge impact on us. And in 2016, the Supreme Court overruled the amnesty law in El Salvador and ordered the reopening of historic cases like El Mozote, y Calabozo, these massacres, crimes against humanity, war crimes committed during the armed conflict period. And Cristosal had recruited lawyers like David Morales to become part of our leadership team. But he was notified, like in the first week of joining our team in El Salvador, that the El Mozote case was reopening. And so we had to decide, could we assume that role, and we decided that we were uniquely prepared to do that and sustain, over the long term, the litigation and support of the victims of El Mozote. And so in that process, we began to learn about accompanying different types of victims, but also we had to learn about building case theory, about litigating, using law to defend international or to seek justice for international crimes, and also to do investigative forensic investigation work. And so those are some of the, I could go on and on, but those are some of the key pieces that kind of emerged without planning necessarily. They emerged out of needs in an evolving context that build the core of our programming. Today, I think if we want to say, what does Cristosal do? We protect victims, we provide legal support, we do investigation, and we do communications and advocacy with victims.
Thank you so much, Noah. Has any of that work changed this year? And we also know that several organizations in Central America were heavily impacted by funding cuts to USAID this year. So I'm curious if that has impacted Cristosal's work at all, or what other things have happened this year that have changed the way that Cristosal has been operating up until earlier this year.
I mean, this year, I think we've had to rethink our program structure, our organizational structure about 3 times in like 5 months. So much has changed, but you're right. Really for us, starting in November of the elections in the United States, I remember that President Bukele was one of the first people to call President Trump and congratulate him. And President Bukele tweeted out about his call with Trump that he asked for assistance to organizations like Cristosal and to journalists be cut. And so really after the elections, I think, I remember feeling a little bit despondent for about 2 days, and then I realized that the world had changed and that Cristosal needs to change, and that our new challenge is to develop a model of a human rights organization that can survive in this new world. So starting in November of last year, we began to make changes, both in how we finance the organization, the organizational structure and staffing. And what we came down on in terms of like strategy and mandate were 3 principles. What does Cristosal do? We are dedicated to justice, meaning that we're going to continue to walk with victims as they seek justice and attend to their needs of protection and other support. We are committed to truth, creating and building on the evidentiary base that we have about mass human rights violations for justice today, justice tomorrow, but also historic truth. Authoritarian context, I think what's lost first is information and truth. And then last, voice. Continue to commit to our communications, our voice in the societies that our voice in defense of rights, but also in supporting victims as they exercise their voice. So that was our strategy that when we began to rethink justice, truth, and voice, and we structured our programs around that. And then there was more upheaval in El Salvador with the foreign agents law, with the persecution and detention of our colleague Ruth, and the threats against other members of our leadership staff. And so we're relocating, but we haven't changed our core objectives, which remain justice, truth, and voice.
Thank you, Noah. I think also a very important moment after the elections and the beginning of this year was the illegal forced transfer of the 200 plus Venezuelans that were sent to Secot. And following that event, the report that was repeatedly cited was the incredible work that Cristosal had done to record the human rights violations that were taking place at Secot prior to that, because there was people that were being detained in that prison prior to the Venezuelan migrants also coming. So I'm curious how that event also I think shifted. Did things increase following that event, like hostility towards the organization, or just the environment of civil society organizations in El Salvador? How was that for your organization?
Now that we've been a little nostalgic on the call, but it just occurred to me that you remember in 2015 there was a child migrant crisis at the U.S. southern border. And all of a sudden people were asking, like, what's the context? How does this happen? What should be done? And Cristosal was uniquely positioned to answer that because we had been working with internally displaced people. We had been signaling that this is a potential crisis, that people were fleeing gang violence, and that was one of the ways to explain how families were separating themselves and sending their children alone, right? And so it's interesting that sometimes it's until crisis explodes outside of El Salvador that people are willing to see some of the advocacy and evidence that we've been building. And that's the same with the case when 258 migrants were disappeared into the Secot, the terrorist prison of Nayib Bukele. It was for us always illustrative of something more systematic, something even bigger that has been going on for a long time in Salvadoran prisons, which is mass arbitrary detention, mass forced disappearance, people not having contact with their families, with their lawyers, families not knowing if they're dead or alive, and then the systematic practices of torture and killings. And we had produced, over the first 2 years of the state of exception, a massive and abundant body of evidence about those very serious and massive violations of human rights. And so when the Venezuelans are sent there, because the United States contracts that prison system where mass torture and killings are happening, the world has a reason to look again at the evidentiary base that we had already been presenting. And so that did change things for us in some ways. I think that the issue that we had been advocating on for years prior finally made sense in a broader context globally. We were able to, in some ways, there was like a truth about hundreds of people being disappeared into a terror prison with no trial and no right to defense, no due process, and no access even to their families. That told a story that was emblematic of something else that was going on, and so there was increased international attention. I don't know for sure if that made Cristosal more of a problem for the Salvadoran government. I'm not sure if there was like an inflection point specifically there. I think that it's a government that doesn't tolerate anyone who doesn't align wholly with their positions and in their support. And I think that that's just part of the nature of their autocratic regime. No necessarily that there's one issue that could break the straw that broke the camel's back. I think it's really that we have been consistently denouncing both their abuses of power, the dismantling of democracy, the corruption, the torture, and the killings over time. And we have built credibility through our technical work, through our public advocacy. And that really, I think, showed when the deportations happened, right? But I think that's something that was built over time.
Yeah, it was one of the many factors that has attributed to just the global attention that the country has been receiving. And as you just stated, it's just a really concrete example of why we need to be aware of what's happening around us globally. There are dangerous patterns of ways that these autocratic governments are using each other as blueprints. And I think the situation that we witnessed in March with the Venezuelan migrants being forcefully sent there is that it was only possible because SICOT has been allowed to exist for as long as it has. So I think that the work that you all did has been incredible, and it was an incredible resource to just get the story out of what this infrastructure was and continues to be, because Secot continues to remain open despite the fact that the 250 people have been released. And unfortunately, we have been hearing from these individuals how abusive the facility has been. Um, and now I guess I want to turn a little bit. Somebody who's been really one of the many people in your team who has been very impactful has been Ruth Lopez. And as a director myself, I can only imagine how difficult it has been to have one of your staff members detained. Ruth has now been detained for over 2 months. She's been instrumental to this fight for human rights in El Salvador. And she was recently recognized for her work, receiving the American Bar Association International Human Rights Award. How did Cristosal respond to that arbitrary detention of Ruth Lopez? What did this mean for the organization and for civil society organizations in the country?
Yeah, and to link it to your previous question, Ruth was leading the legal team that was providing support to the Venezuelan families. She, along with two other colleagues, presented 80 different habeas corpus claims to the Salvadoran Supreme Court on behalf of the Venezuelans. Ruth was a person who was an ally to people who suffered abuses of power. And ironically or sadly, now that she's a political prisoner herself. I think also, I mean, I would like to think a little bit more about the whole CCOT and disappearing of hundreds of migrants as the signs of our times. That somehow got normalized, but really, that type of an agreement could only happen between two presidents who are willing and able to operate outside of any framework of the law. To disappear hundreds of people is something that only autocrats could do. And then later, make another deal to swap those prisoners who were wrongly imprisoned in the Salvador for prisoners who were wrongly imprisoned in Venezuela. It's in normal democratic societies, it's judges who decide who are imprisoned and who are free, not presidents. So it's important just to think of that as a sign of the times that shouldn't be normalized. And Ruth now, is in prison and has suffered those similar patterns of irregularity, illegality in her detention. One of the ways that we first responded was, again, what we always do, document. Ruth was disappeared for 40 hours after her detention. She was accused of a crime originally she could never have committed. She was held for 15 days without seeing a judge. They applied the state of exception to Ruth. The exceptions that you mentioned to due process that were promised for terror groups and gangs are now used to silence critical voices. Then they changed the crime that she was accused of and accused her of a new crime. In no other circumstances are people sent to prison originally. There's usually an administrative process in which people are able to clear up whatever discrepancies about wealth are found. Ruth didn't have that process. They jumped right in and detained her. And they also offered, they're trying her in secret. She's asked for a public trial and they're going to try her in secret. Then they transfer her to a prison where she doesn't have access to her families. And we hope yesterday her legal team made an effort to visit, and we hope that was successful. But those are the similar patterns. The human rights defenders, along with Ruth, Alejandro Enriquez, Jose Angel, Enrique Anaya, have all suffered short-term forced disappearances, have all suffered due process violations, and all are facing accusations before a justice system where nobody really has very much confidence that they will have an impartial trial or even be able to defend themselves. So that's the context. Our reaction was also, we told our staff that our priority is defending our colleague. Part of our decision to relocate was to make sure that we could continue to do that. We can't do much for Ruth if we're all in prison. And so, I think that Ruth's detention, it's something that we all feel every single moment of every day. We also feel deeply the tension of Enrique Anaya, we have no doubt that he was arrested because of his defense of Ruth and his denouncements of the illegalities of her detention. He was in our office on Friday evening, and Saturday morning he was pulled out of his house at gunpoint by Salvadoran police. And so, I think that part of what our work now is a commitment to the political prisoners in El Salvador. It's an unrenounceable commitment that we have to make, support them, struggle and fight for their freedom, but also for their protection while they're in detention.
Thank you. And you mentioned a little bit earlier that you've had to restructure about 3, 4 times this year, like rethink how are you changing things? How does Cristosal operate in these like ever changing conditions? So following like this critical point of Ruth's arrest, um, were there certain conversations or strategies that you had to change as part of your institutional presence? How did that impact your team? And has that had like a chilling effect on how other civil society organizations operate within the country?
Well, we are, I think a lot of the people connected today know that in El Salvador, there has been recently sort of a wave of repression that's been directed towards journalists and human rights defenders, but specifically Cristosal has been a target. And we believe that we were targeted, as Ruth was also targeted, to send a message to the whole society. The dissent, the people who think differently from the regime won't be tolerated, and that being critical and denouncing abuses has reprisals, including prison or exile. And so that's the message I think that the regime wanted to send. The persecution, exile, and political persecution is a political violence that has the objective of having an impact in controlling the behavior of the whole society. And so you see people in El Salvador, hundreds of people have fled the country in the last few months. Journalists, professionals, business people, human rights defenders, community organizers, environmental defenders. And there's a sense in El Salvador right now, and with the foreign agents law, I think it's even more acute, that there is a risk for not aligning. There's a risk for daring to do things like propose alternatives or ask for information or help on things that are uncomfortable for the government, or denouncing abuses and seeking justice. These are all things that the message is clear won't be tolerated in El Salvador. And when we, I think things happened really quickly after Ruth was arrested. First, we moved very quickly to build a legal defense team that specialized in the type of criminal law that this pertains to the crimes that she was accused of. And then, we were focusing on trying to sustain that defense and protect Ruth. And then the foreign agents law happened. And, I think, and Enrique's arrest, different threats that we received against some other members of our leadership, police officers are going to the homes of some of our staff, monitoring and surveillance at their homes and around our office. And at that point, I think we had to make a quick decision to enter into like a phase of protection. And that's when we began to plan the relocation and the extraction of our team. And that was something that, involved the whole of our organization. Like some of the unsung heroes are really like our admin staff, our accountants and things like that who have just acted heroically. It's interesting that, when we think about exile, we've debated Cristosal, are we in exile if Cristosal already had an office in Guatemala as an organization? But there are individuals on our team, and not everybody, who have reason to believe that they can't return to El Salvador because of credible threats. And then there's another part of our team who, when we offered the option of relocating, this made a decision of conscience and conviction that they wanted to continue the work with Cristosal, the mission, and made the sacrifice to relocate. So that was, the first adaptation is the protection phase, the relocation phase, and now we are, I think, exiting that and beginning to relook at the landscape, the risks, the opportunities, and how we continue in our mission. I think that one of the things that we're absolutely clear about is that repression historically has never worked to stop the human rights movement, and it won't stop Cristosal.
Thank you, Noah. I think that the question that you guys post yourself, like, are we in exile? And I mean, what you said after that is like so important because it's people who have lived there, whose family, loved ones, like the place they want to be is in El Salvador. And to not be able to do that, it really is uprooting somebody from where they've been their whole life and where they want to call home. So I can only imagine it's a very difficult situation that you and your staff are living in this moment. And it's great that you all are, I mean, doing the best that you can to provide that support for your staff. Before I move to the next question, I just want to remind everyone to please include their questions in the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We're getting very close to finishing this first facilitated discussion, and then we'll move to Q&A. You mentioned already a little bit about like the back end work of what it takes to move the organization's operations from El Salvador. And you mentioned you already had an office in Guatemala. But are there like other like changes this poses for the work? Is just because you're not in El Salvador does not mean you're not going to do work in El Salvador. So we'd love to hear more about what those priorities look like now, working from outside the country.
Yeah, I think we're definitely in a phase of adaptation and thinking through some of those things. We don't have perfect answers yet that we can share. Um, and we've gotten used to adaptation. I think in El Salvador, where the president dictates from one day to the next how life in the country will be, like we've constantly had to change. Um, but one of the things that I think we have pretty good clarity about is that we feel like, in terms of cases that we had in litigation, for example, Ruth and her team had presented over 15 cases, well documented, well investigated cases of grand corruption to the Attorney General and presented formal criminal complaints. We have represented families in El Salvador whose children have been disappeared, raped, or killed in communities under military occupation. We represent families of people whose loved ones died as a consequence of torture in prisons. And we brought these cases to the Salvadoran justice system. And up to this point, the response has been impunity. So we think in this new phase, the victims have the right, now having exhausted the national justice system, to seek international justice and seek justice in the international system. And so that's something that will be refocusing on and supporting families that want to continue to pursue just truth and justice outside of El Salvador. The other thing I think that's absolutely important is as we go forward is, to continue to be a reservoir of information. In El Salvador, there's no access to public information. There's a strong system of control and intimidation that makes it very difficult to do human rights documentation. And we have a strong evidentiary base already established. And like I said before, a commitment to future truth and justice through guarding information. Those are definitely going to be parts of Cristosal going forward. And here in exile, I think we also see, our leadership role in supporting, now dozens of people, Salvadorans who are fleeing the country, and many of them not with the privilege that we have to still have our organization and the organizational support behind us. So we're working hard to generate small scale protection responses for the other exiles here as well.
which is very important because unfortunately we're seeing the situation just escalate, and we're likely to see more people having to do the same for their own protection. I want to close out this facilitated portion of our discussion, asking what probably seems like a big question, but an important one. What lessons does this experience teach us about the resilience of civil society? And what message would you send to those who defend democracy in authoritarian contexts?
That last one, there's a lesson that I think through almost every day about. It's that old poem that they wrote about Nazi Germany, that first they came for the communists and I wasn't communist, so I had said nothing. In El Salvador, it's and history tends to repeat itself, I think, and this is not the first wave of exile and political repression under the Bukele regime. First, they went for the political opposition, and many of us didn't agree with them or didn't necessarily trust them, but we said nothing as they were imprisoned for years without trial, and many of them were forced into exile. Then, when they overthrew the courts and the attorney generals, many of the judges and specifically the attorney generals, like the investigators who were investigating the Bukele regime for corruption and their partnership with the gangs, fled the country. Then they went after the mining movement and their leadership. Then they went after veterans who were organizing marches and arrested their leadership. And so I guess one of the big lessons that I would say is that humans tend to want to normalize their context. They look at history as, or maybe they see themselves as exceptional to history, but we have to learn to read the patterns. Even if that means that recognizing those historical patterns of autocracy and abuse require difficult choices or risks in order to defend democracy and defend freedoms. In short, if a government has decided to violate the rights of a group of people, even a group of people different from you that you don't agree with, that you maybe aren't fully sure that they deserve all the protections of the law, you should always know that when the government already made that decision to violate their rights, they've made a decision they can violate your rights. And so being indifferent to exceptions to human rights and the violations um, is unacceptable. That's the big lesson that I come back to. And when you're seeing the cost of exile, or in the case of the families of Enrique and Ruth, things like that, the cost of prison is really high. And you question, would we have been better off if we kept our heads down, if we didn't say anything? And that's one of the things that's really difficult to deal with. But I think that going back to my original point there is that there's no safety in silence when a government has decided to consolidate power and has decided that they can do that and run on top of trample the rights of others. There's nobody will be safe. And I think that's what the lessons that you can take from El Salvador are.
Thank you, Noah. Exactly. Silence does not save any of us, and democracy is not a place or a thing. It's something constant that we have to always be fighting for and keeping top of mind. We really appreciate your insights, and I think in the moment that um, organizations in the U.S. are living, they're drawing on the experience of leaders who have been on the front lines of these cycles of authoritarianism in the region, to learn how to not only survive this moment but ensure that, as you said, documenting, keeping public record to know that history will be looking at this time and ask us what were we doing in this moment. So it's just super important that everyone listening to this or who will continue to do this work continues to spread the word about the work that organizations like Cristosal continue to do. Thank you so much for your insights. We're now going to open the floor for questions from the audience, and we've received quite a few already. So I'm going to start with this first one. It says the recent U.S. and El Salvador agreement that led to the transfer of over 280 men to Secot, with most Salvadorans transferred still imprisoned, marks an escalation in the two governments' collaboration on openly and humane migration policies. And I think maybe you touched on this earlier in our conversation, but are there any other challenges and opportunities that this poses for Cristosal's advocacy?
The specifically the immigration deal between Trump and Bukele does represent opportunities. Cristosal has built relationships and been working with 160 Venezuelan families since their disappearance in Secot. And now we're supporting with them in doing more technical documentation of what happened. There's media is getting taking testimonies and declarations, but what's needed is more systematic documentation to be able to develop the patterns and also identify in what ways those are reinforced by the existing known patterns of torture and abuse that we have. And so though that partnership with Venezuelan families and also human rights organizations is really unique. I think it may be something that needs to be expanded on. I just said that our rights are interconnected and interdependent, even with people who are different from us. And so the human rights movement itself needs to be able to build capacity to work in an interconnected way and in solidarity. And so that's, I would say, even an exciting thing. That we have a common cause with the Venezuelan families and the Venezuelans who have been struggling to defend democracy, for so long there. That's one opportunity. I think the other thing that is happening in some ways is, that El Salvador and Central America, unfortunately, is on the international radar because of this. And that's an opportunity to counter the disinformation of the regime. I think that we say it's a phrase that came from our work in Amozote, but that the truth of the victims sooner or later imposes on reality, even imposes on propaganda and defamation campaigns and disinformation. And so I think as the international community's attention has been called to the situation in El Salvador, the truth of the victims every day imposes more and more. And so I think that that's a great opportunity for change and transformation.
Definitely. Narrative change in this moment is crucial to combat disinformation, as you said. Um, the next one, how did Cristosal respond to the unconstitutional re-election of Nayib Bukele?
So here's a funny historical anecdote. In El Salvador, there's a historical pattern about how dictators govern. And El Salvador is one of the countries that has the longest standing chain of dictatorships, both civilian and military, up until the peace accords. And that's in like Latin America as a competitive environment for sort of authoritarian governance. Um, and and so when President Bukele sought re-election against 7 articles of the Constitution that clearly prohibit it, what we saw was sort of the announcing of the dictatorship, consistent with the historical pattern. Salvadoran dictators, almost in their entirety, have sought re-election illegally against the Constitution and have governed almost entirely using states of exceptions and creating emergencies and the ideas of internal enemies. So for us, when President Bukele sought to illegally re-elect himself and used his loyalists in the courts after a coup of the courts, we saw that as sort of a consummation of the authoritarian regime. We presented, Ruth was part of this as well, inconstitutionality claims to the Salvadoran Supreme Court about re-election. And obviously without an independent court willing to check executive power, the claim didn't go far. But we were a vocal critic denouncing that abuse of constitutional power in El Salvador. And I'll close with this. People saw that as like a technicality. I remember being in a meeting at one embassy, And the people said, yeah, but in my country, you're allowed to be reelected twice in a row. So I don't see the problem. And I said to him that, yeah, but also in basketball, you can use your hands to touch the ball, and in football, you can't. They're two different systems. In El Salvador, the executive has tremendous power. It's a very strong executive with a very specific check on power that you can only be the president for one term in a row. So when that power, that check on power is removed, history in El Salvador shows us that what proceeds is autocracy.
That's the perfect way of putting it. Thank you. Um, the next question we have is, what type of interventions could we envision, if any, via international law? How could any institutions within European Union get involved in some ways?
Well, I think that the European Union has different human rights commissions and institutions, um, but they have been very cautious up until this point about being publicly critical of President Bukele. And one of the reasons is this narrative of popularity, that the president is popular. How can we, as outside, political forces, criticize something that the Salvadoran people seem to be approving? I just would respond to that by saying that if we look carefully at the polls, Salvadorans in the majority say they support the president, but they also say in similar majorities that they would be afraid to express an opinion not aligned with the president or his party. And so you have a population that says they support the president, but they're afraid to tell you if they did it. And that's a symptom of not a free and open society, but a closed and autocratic one. And so if the international community will use popularity to provide exceptions to torture, corruption, killing, dismantling of democratic institutions, I think that they do that at the risk of peace and stability more broadly in the world.
Thank you, Noah. And actually, we have two more. What is the level of awareness of human rights among the Salvadoran people? What is lacking and why?
That's an interesting question. Since I was in El Salvador for 20 years, so half of my life. So the first thing that I did when I was in El Salvador was workshops about what are human rights. Um, and I did that with former soldiers from battalions that we knew were responsible for terrible human rights atrocities. I did that with refugee communities, with former combatants from the guerrilla army, and just campesinos and generally, populations in general, right? And there's no way, there's this idea like that you hear this false idea that like human rights are an imposition, a globalist agenda. They're like a conspiracy of the international community. If you talk to people from their own family experiences, if not personal experiences, they know deeply what human equality and dignity means. And it's almost universal that people aspire to that. What becomes more challenging is that human rights defenders tend to talk about human rights in legal terms that people don't understand. And that makes it so there's sort of a distance between what the narratives of human rights organizations are and how people very personally feel their own desires and longings for greater freedom and equality. And I think in the polls, if we want to go to polls again, one of the things that has been interesting is that Salvadorans say they support the state of exception. And that when we talked to them, we did hundreds of community dialogues about the state of exception. People understand the state of exception is the idea that the government is persecuting or is pursuing and detaining gang members. I'm in agreement with that. We need in democratic societies effective law enforcement that's able to investigate and use democratic institutions to hold criminals accountable. But Salvadorans also say in the polls that they're in majorities that they are not in agreement with mass arbitrary detention, that they're not in agreement when family members of people who die in custody of the state are not informed of their deaths. They're not in agreement and deeply concerned about the impacts of children, both children and families of people or families that have suffered arbitrary detentions and killings, but also children themselves who have been detained. And there is strong evidence developed by Cristosal, Human Rights Watch, and other organizations that even prisons, children's prisons, there are strong patterns of torture, killing, and even rape. So Salvadorans know what rights are. They long for them. When they see abuses, they know what they are. But realities are more complicated. At the end of the day, we believe, and we think that most Salvadorans agree with us, that Salvadorans deserve something better than living submitted or subjected to gang violence or subjected to dictatorship. There's a better option.
Yes, freedom and safety are not should not be at the hands of somebody with that kind of agenda for the country. And it sounds like the work that you all have been doing to educate is addressing and unpacking that misinformation that's been taking place in the country. Um, there's we have a few more minutes. And there's a couple more questions that were added. Do you think that there will be accountability for the human rights violations under Bukele? Um, Sorry, I'm reading this in Spanish. Y una pregunta vinculada que nos piden. No, ¿habrá algún caso en El Salvador que se
Will there
podría
be any
calificar
case in
como
El
delito
Salvador
de
that could
lesa
be
humanidad?
qualified as a massive human rights violation?
No, so we're in our first human rights report about the state of exception. No, I'm gonna backtrack. When we were denouncing the dismantling of the independence of the justice system and the capture of different democratic institutions in the country, we presented different cases to the Salvadoran Supreme Court, and we always warned that when the checks on powers are gone, the guardrails against mass and systematic abuse are also gone. So as democracy crumbles, populations are naturally at risk of abuse. And then with the state of exception, in the first year, we warn the mass arbitrary detentions that happened just in the first year and the indicators of torture that we had already known could constitute crimes against humanity. And now as the evidentiary base has grown, we are absolutely convinced, we have the conviction that the Salvadoran government has committed crimes against humanity in the context of the state of exception. The issue of accountability is a complicated one. I remember when we began the prosecution of the El Mozote massacre, we had to learn how to do that work from our colleagues here in Guatemala, who had already had success in cases of genocide and crimes against humanity for the Civil War in Guatemala. And in one meeting between the women of Ceposarco and members of the El Mozote community, the women who were indigenous said that in our system of the indigenous people of Guatemala, we already have truth and justice. But what we're looking for now is that the state system, the system of the state that violated our rights, also recognize that truth and make actions towards justice. And I think that that's not unique to indigenous people. That truth and justice doesn't need to have the formal sanctioning of the state in order to already exist among the victims. And I think in El Salvador, especially at the end of last year, we saw the emergence of different community organizations and victims groups that validated each other, that their truth was real. And in that sense, history will remember. Whether the Salvadoran justice institutions will reform themselves one day and act in favor of the victims and stop protecting the perpetrators, I don't know for sure. International justice is slow, but it is a right, and it's a right that doesn't expire with time.
Thank you. And for our very last question, thank you for sharing your experience. My question is the following: did the cuts in USAID, DOS, Department of State funding impact your decision to suspend your operations?
No, because that had already happened. we had already, as I said earlier, that in November we already made the decision that Cristosal, the notifications that we got from USAID was that our projects were being put on hold while they were evaluated for their alignment with the America First priorities. And I think we had no illusion that they weren't going to be determined to align with the America First priorities, and that our partnership with the Department of State and USAID and other US funding agencies was not around the America First agenda, rather around universal values of human rights and democracy. And if that's gone, then the relationship was gone. And that's why we began to move even before our projects were canceled to change. Cristosal made the decision that we no longer expect or even desire necessarily funding from governments. I think this is one of the realities that we have to face, not only from the US, but other foreign assistance, is that the human rights movement will have to be sustained by people who are committed and have conviction. The movement has to be maintained by the movement, not by governments. And if we're being honest too, I've talked a lot about history because I'm being nostalgic and reflective, but the human rights movement, for the majority of its history, has been at odds with states and governments, and has been sustained by people who have visions of a better world and take the risk to do something about it.
Thank you, Noah. Thank you so much for sharing, as you said at the beginning, a little bit of the history and just what you all have been experiencing over the last several months. Anything else you want to say before I begin closing us?
Maybe just again, thank everybody for the support and the solidarity. We have a long struggle ahead. And I think that what we are struggling for in Central America is universal. That these are the signs of our times, and now more than ever, solidarity and mutual support is what will sustain this struggle. So thank you all. I'm so grateful. So happy to be here with you, Dulce. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you everyone very much for joining us for this critical conversation. We are deeply grateful to Noah Bullock and the entire Cristosal team, past, present, and future, for their courage, their commitment, and the clarity in defending human rights. Thank you again to our co-sponsors, Center for Engagement and Democracy in the Americas, the Center for Gender and Refugee Studies, Human Rights First, and Refugees International. We need to continue speaking up for human rights across borders. As many freedom fighters have said in the past, our collective liberation is interconnected. At Alianza Americas, we reaffirm our commitment to strengthening democracy and justice, both within and outside our countries of origin. One concrete way you can support organizations like Cristosal today is by donating. And our team will be, or probably already has been, sharing the link in the chat where you can donate to Cristosal directly. Exile is not easy, as Noah has shared with us today. We invite you to support Cristosal and the several other civil society organizations in Central America who are fighting on the front lines. If you would like to support human rights work carried out by Cristosal and Alianza Americas, you can make donations to our website or the links we've shared in the chat. Every contribution strengthens our work at this critical moment. We invite you to continue to stay in touch, share this recording with your networks, stay informed, and thank you again. We look forward to seeing you at the next conversation. Take care.